So hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. I'm Carl Binder, and this is Shane Isley, and we're going to be talking about accomplishment-based coaching today. And just the way this is going to go is I'm going to do kind of an overview of this thing, and then we're going to have a really interesting conversation with Shane, who's done a lot of work with this. So Shane, welcome. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm excited.
So I guess we'll go to the slides, and I hope I won't be taking too much time in these slides, but we'll see what happens. So here we go. So as I mentioned, this is, and as you signed up for, we hope this is accomplishment-based coaching and supervision with an emphasis on the accomplishment part, because as you probably know, hi everybody. There's a lot of friends here. As you probably know, most coaching that people engage in is not really focused on what we call accomplishments. And we want to unpack that because we think it has a lot of power and a lot of implications for effective performance coaching. Before we get into it, one thing I wanted to mention is we may go a bit over an hour, but of course we record these sessions and you'll get the link to the sessions afterwards. We've just had a bunch of conversations lately, Shane and I, and he has so much stuff to talk about and so many implications of this that I don't want to cut it short. So as I say, we may go a little bit after, longer than an hour. And if you have to drop off, no problem. But I'm hoping, you might want to watch the end if you have to drop off when we send you the recording. Anyway, we're not going to go into enormous detail about performance thinking. If you want to know a lot more, we have a YouTube channel at performancethinking.tv, and it has recordings of our now 11 past webinars, plus a whole bunch of short playlists, one on performance coaching, one on performance consulting, one on sales enablement, and some others. And we're continuing to grow that. So if you want more, there's definitely more to be had. Next time, we're pretty excited, actually. We're going to talk about performance thinking for what our late friend and colleague, Dr. Roger Kaufman, called MEGA. That is societal challenges. And we're going to some extent, be honoring Roger because he was a longtime friend, colleague, and supporter who spent, for many years, he was always saying, Carl, you need to include MEGA in your approach. And so I think we are, not always explicitly, but in ways that I think you'll find interesting. And we'll sort of provide an overview of how we think this can apply. And then we want to talk a little bit about a current societal challenge related to public safety. So we'll be talking about that next time on September 15th. And then there's a bunch of other topics we're going to cover going forward. One that's just a recurring topic in our practitioner program and with our colleagues is how do we get out of the training box? That is, how do we not assume that training is the solution to performance problems? And how do we engage our stakeholders in a larger set of components to an intervention than just skills and knowledge? Second one, and Barbara Buckland's here, I see, she and I did a analysis of HR business partners' performance a while back, and I want to share that a little bit because it's had some interesting implications for how HR business partners can contribute to performance. We're going to talk, not sure when, but with Peter Doms about making strategic plans executable, which is something that we've been working on with him a little bit. Our friend Gina Restor-Zadro is very interested in sort of, to some extent, debunking, but also clarifying this whole current hot topic of learning in the flow. We'll probably talk about agile talent development, which we'll touch on a little bit today. And there's a lot more, but that's kind of over the coming months, some of the topics we'll be addressing. So what I want to do now is what we do virtually every time, which is I want to put up a little poll, and I'm interested in you all sort of responding to this. It's a set of labels, if you want, and they, several, it's possible that more than one fits you. But what I'd like to do, oops, hold on for a second, just a second. I want to do something else here. I want to start the poll just a second, because I just realized that we often have this problem where we'll display the results at the end. So here we go. So if you could select what best fits your role. Are you a senior leader? Are you a manager or supervisor who might coach others? Are you a performance consultant, which I think so far almost everybody is? Are you involved in developing leaders, managers, and coaches? Are you perhaps more generally a trainer, instructional designer? or possibly a human resources or talent development professional, or maybe other. So you're starting to fill this out, and it looks like it's an interesting mix. There's some senior leaders here, and the manager, supervisor, and performance consultants are neck and neck. And we've got a few people who are trainers or instructional designers beyond their performance consulting role. So I'll wait till that sort of settles out a little bit. People are still responding, and I really appreciate it. I'm hoping this time when we get to the end, when I click end poll, you'll be able to see the results. And it looks to me like we're just pretty much to the end. So not sure if you can see the results now, but we've got a pretty good mix here. We've got some senior folks. And one of the things we've learned is that even very senior executives with their management teams or whatever can learn a great deal from our coaching approach. Certainly managers or supervisors are right in the mix of people who should be coaching those that work with and for them. Performance consultants can always benefit from learning about an approach that helps individuals, which is really what this coaching approach is. And then if you're involved in developing leaders and managers, obviously that's an application for this. So thanks everybody for responding. Let's keep going with the slides then. So here's our agenda. We want to talk a little bit about what is coaching, because people have different views about what coaching is, and we have a particular approach which is not incompatible with others. Some people's versions of coaching look a little bit more like non-directive therapy, where the coach is kind of asking a lot of questions to help the person being coached unpack what their problems are and then possibly come up with solutions. Some coaches function almost like a therapist in the sense of being someone you can trust and you can work with, and there's a want about how we think about coaching, which really comes from its origins in athletic coaching. Then we want to talk about the implications of focusing on accomplishments in a coaching process, because most people don't do that. Most coaching is really behavior-based, as far as we can tell. And then we want to touch on this notion that an accomplishment-based coaching approach can serve as a vehicle for both agile talent development and something we've been getting more and more interested in recently, applying it to servant leadership, which is a phrase that's been around for a long time. And I'm learning more and more about it, as you'll hear briefly a little bit later. And then the high point of the day, assuming I can get through this other stuff pretty quickly, is going to be conversation with Shane, who has had 2 companies in which he used this coaching approach as a management and coaching tool, and now has been consulting to behavioral health companies for several years, quite a few years, introducing this. So he's seen the effects of accomplishment-based coaching in organizations large and small. And whether it's behavioral health or some other field, the things that he has to say about it are quite interesting and relevant. And then we'll hopefully have some time for Q&A at the end. So, you know, when I hear the word coaching, I don't know about you all, but when I hear the word coaching, I think of athletics. And when you look out and see, you know, the business coaching models that are out there, they don't really look quite the same. But we sort of start out with athletics as the way we think about it. And to use the word accomplishment, here's a few athletic accomplishments: a ball through the hoop, a crew that just won the race before the other one, a couple baseball players, one of whom caught and prevented the home run, and the other one of whom, you know, the home run happened. Here's a touchdown. Any area of performance in the athletic or sports world has very clear accomplishments that people are trying to enable their folks to produce. And how do they do that? Well, it's very directive. You know, here's a person helping this person form a proper golf swing. Here's the coach, you know, encouraging, but also I'm sure correcting the members of that rowing team out there in the water. Here's somebody focusing on form. Here's a guy helping a kid to hold a basketball properly, and so forth. So what do coaches do? Coaches in the athletic world, they try to help people accomplish whatever it is the game is supposed to be about. And, you know, I would argue that if you can string a few words together about what coaches do in that context, first of all, they help people engage. They really engage the people they're coaching in an active way. They develop them. They increase their capabilities. They improve their performance, and they help people succeed. So that's kind of generally what we think of as coaches. And what I like to do is sort of, they say you're supposed to tell people what you're going to say and then say it and then tell them what you said. I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what we think sort of high points are of this accomplishment-based approach. First thing is, when you focus on accomplishments, or as you'll see, we think of accomplishments as the valuable products of behavior, you connect people, their day-to-day activity, up to organizational results. Because whether your accomplishment is a relationship or a widget or a report or a decision, presumably that has some connection to some business result that you're trying to achieve or organizational result. And when you focus on accomplishments, it's a lot easier to clarify to the individual how they're making a difference. The other cool thing about accomplishments as the focus of coaching is that when you know what behavior is supposed to produce and you know what good looks like, it's a lot easier to set expectations for the performer, whether it's for a good relationship that they're trying to develop as a salesperson, or a proposal, or a widget, or a budget, or whatever it is. If we have well-defined criteria for what a good accomplishment is, it's a lot easier to set expectations for people. In fact, people have their own expectations at that point because they see what the product is supposed to be. It also, the flip side of that is it allows you to provide feedback. There was an article a couple of years ago in the Harvard Business Review that I just picked up in an airport, and it was about all the problems with feedback. And so many of us are, I think, quite familiar with feedback positives and negatives, good stuff about feedback and places where feedback goes wrong. And what I realized when I was reading the article was, I said, wait a minute, if I know what my behavior is supposed to produce, I actually know whether I was successful or not. And I can begin to diagnose, if it's not a good one, whatever that accomplishment is, what it is I could do better. And certainly my coach can do that. There's another thing that my former partner used to say, and we'll come back to this, but the notion that once you define accomplishments, it liberates behavior. Now, you don't want to be liberating behavior in nuclear plants or places where you have to have very precisely defined behavior. But in many areas that we work, you can accomplish the same thing in a variety of ways. And when you're clear about the output, the accomplishment, then people actually have some freedom to try different ways. And sometimes you discover innovative or exemplary ways to accomplish the same thing. And what we'll talk about a little bit later is that also when you define accomplishments or outputs as the valuable products of people's behavior, and most importantly, their contributions to the organization or the company or the society, it gives us a way to drive a continuous talent development approach. And if we bring the sort of philosophy of servant leadership to it, it gives us a way to help the people in a big way. So those are some of the things that we'd like to kind of touch on as we go through this fairly quickly. And then I think will be themes that may come up in the conversation with Shane. So let me tell you a little bit about how this evolved. And many, many of you already know this. You know about performance thinking. So this is a short version. But as many of you maybe know, Tom Gilbert, a very, very important pioneer in the field of performance improvement, published his rather famous book, Human Competence, in 1978. And in it, he said this. He said, in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. But we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. Now, this was a very big paradigm shift for many of us who had come up through instructional technology or training in various different ways or organizational behavior management, because we had always focused on behavior. But when Tom delivered that message and other people within the community of performance improvement, human performance technology, ISPI, pursued it, particularly Joe Harless, who was a major protege of Tom Gilbert, it changed a lot. And this is really where we start. Now, we have a phrase, work outputs, and from here on out, you'll be hearing me use that phrase. The reason is because the word accomplishment, even though it's a wonderful word and it's very compelling because it sounds like you've done something valuable, if you look at the word accomplishment in the dictionary, there are more definitions that have to do with the completion of behavior than the products of behavior. And if you look out in the literature of performance improvement, you see an awful lot of different ways that people use the word accomplishment. Sometimes they mean big business results. Sometimes they mean changes in behavior. Sometimes they mean smaller outcomes. They mean lots of different things. So when we began this work some years ago, which was focused on having plain English so that anybody could understand what we were talking about, we coined the phrase work outputs because it definitely sounds like it's the product of something rather than the behaviors for producing it. And it also, because it's plural, sounds like you can count them. And that's extremely important from a measurement point of view. So the ramifications of this paradigm shift are a redefinition of performance, or at least a clarification about it. Because what we would say, following on Gilbert and Harless and others, is that human performance has three components. It has behavior or activity that produces work outputs or accomplishments that are valuable to the extent that they contribute to business results, or if we take Roger Kaufman's perspective about mega into mind, possibly societal results. So we use a sports model. And in fact, I'm told by one of my colleagues who's been teaching our practitioner program now for years at our largest client that this soccer girl is famous. She's obviously, if this were animated, behaving. She's kicking the ball. And it will produce, if she's lucky or fortunate or skilled, either a ball in the net, the goal, or possibly a ball at the right place by her teammate's head or foot to get it into the goal. But the idea is that's the valuable work output. And it's valuable because it contributes to organizational results, winning the game, basically, or competing in the game. Now, we have fairly precise meanings of these terms. In behavior, we mean actions. We encourage people to use active verbs to describe them. Work outputs are things. We say they're countable nouns. It's information we do not accept as a work output because I don't know how to count it. I can count reports or updates or data sets, but there's some nouns that actually are not countable, and we don't like using those if we can help it. And then organizational results, we focus on organization-wide results. So there's lots of intermediate results in organizations, but we're trying to make a line of sight between the product of individuals or teams or process outputs and the success of the organization. So our first model of our two models is the performance chain, and it falls right out of what we just talked about. We're looking at organizational or business results, things like what you see there, product sales, revenue, profits, etc. We back up from that and say, okay, we're going to look at this performance. What are the work outputs involved? And there's lots of different kinds. And the words under that name, especially those of you who've been through our programs, know those are words that help people think of different kinds of work outputs. And then there's behavior. Once we know what the output is, what do you got to do to produce it? And we can do task analyses. We can look at what the exemplary people do. We can sort of learn what our colleague does, whatever it is. And then there's behavior influences. Well, we're focusing here on work outputs because we think that is the anchor, that is the core, that's the foundation of understanding performance. And of course, behavior influences. And we'll come back to outputs in a minute, but that behavior influences list at the beginning of the performance chain, of course, can be a very long list. And this is another place where Tom Gilbert was influential because Skinner, B.F. Skinner, who's a student of mine, but also was Tom Gilbert was influenced heavily by Skinner, had what was called the three-term contingency in his analysis of behavior. He said that there were discriminative stimuli, or antecedents, as some people later called them, that set the occasion for behavior or responses that hopefully led to reinforcing stimuli or consequences. And Gilbert added the words information, response, and motivation to that. But he built what he called the behavior engineering model, which is very famous in the field of performance improvement. What a big part of Tom's innovation and insight was that when we're working in the real world, the world of work, as Tom used to describe it, we're not working with white Carnot pigeons or hooded rats. That is, each individual is different. And so we can't assume we know what the incentives are that will work for a person. We can't assume that the environment was built for the person that's responding. And we can't assume a prerequisite repertoire. So what he said is, in the environment, there's data that tells you, gives you information and sometimes feedback, expectations and feedback fundamentally. There's instruments, which is his word for all of the things that enable you as you perform to do things. And those can be everything from screwdrivers and software to job aids and having the right people available. And then there were incentives, which were his word for consequences that hopefully are motivating. But what Tom recognized was that as humans, we carry around information. And so-called knowledge itself becomes a kind of antecedent or information, or excuse me, expectation setting and enabling variable. And he used the word capacity to talk about the individual. Is the individual strong enough, analytical enough, sociable enough, et cetera, to match up with the job requirements? And finally, motives are something that will appeal to the behaviorists in the crowd, because what he recognized, like Skinner did, was that we have to define functionally consequences. In other words, you can arrange an incentive that people have no interest in, so it's not going to function as an incentive. So we need to understand people's motives. So this is what Tom sort of added to the mix when it comes to this. But I got excited about this and was working with my teams in the early 80s with it, when we were working with sales and then subsequently customer service organizations. And we were trying to engage our clients, leaders, managers, stakeholders, in this framework. And what we found was that the words were confusing. And so most of you who've ever been in one of these sessions or know about our work know about this. But in about mid-80s, I started tweaking the language. And I kept tweaking it until I could come up with a framework that I knew, simply based on user testing, that people understood. So when I got that the labels that I could use for the 6 cells of this model would be understood, that people would not make category errors, and that they would begin to use them in useful ways, I came up with this. And we subsequently, a vice president of sales training, Tom Hogan at Dun & Bradstreet, one day said, "We're always struggling over what to call that. It's clearly not Gilbert's model exactly anymore. So I was talking about those boxes. So why don't you call it the 6 boxes?" So that's what we did. Now, the 6 boxes framework, evolving from the behavior engineering model, in my experience, both as a trained behavior scientist and in a very practical way, somebody who's been doing performance improvement work for 40 years or so, there's nothing I've ever seen in in any of this that couldn't fit into either one of the cells of this model, or sometimes the relationship between them. So that's the model we use to talk about behavior influences. So let's come back to coaching a little bit. We got these 2 models, and we can glue them together, so to speak. How do you do accomplishment-based coaching? This is the short version. So, well, you start out by saying, what's at stake here? The person you're speaking with, let's be sure we understand what's important right now about whatever the situation is from the business's point of view or the organization's point of view. And then let's take a look at your performance, and let's look at what work outputs maybe there are to add to your capabilities, or to improve, that maybe you need to get better at producing those kinds of requirements analyses or those reports, or possibly things that you just simply need support doing. And let's be sure we understand how they contribute to the organization's results, so you understand your contributions. Once we do that, let's talk about behavior. And this is where something like situational leadership becomes quite relevant, because sometimes you got to go into great detail and be very directive. Other times, the person you're coaching knows exactly what to do. They just need your support. So you talk about behavior at the level of detail that sort of is useful in the conversation. Once you've done that, you can take a look at these 3 elements: business results, work outputs, and behavior, and you can decide what you're going to monitor to see if you made a difference. And there's a whole conversation about measurement we can go into, but to make it simple, those are the 3 elements of performance that we can measure. And business results are lagging indicators. Behavior tends to be expensive to measure, so we do it selectively. Work outputs are a great opportunity very often to monitor things in a way that we can make decisions. Once we got all that in place, then we just use the 6 boxes model, and we say, what's working? What's not working? How can we improve? Let's have a collaborative conversation about some things we could do together, and let's come up with some agreed upon action steps. Why don't you go over and spend some time with John and see how he does it, and you'll kind of get up to speed a little bit on the knowledge you need for that. Maybe we'll give you a job aid. Let me give you a little bit more frequent feedback for the next few weeks. Whatever it is, we come up with some agreed upon action steps to improve that performance. Now, that's a 3-day workshop in like 5 minutes, but that's kind of the logic of that coaching conversation. the core of it, or at least where it typically starts after the business discussion, is let's talk about your work outputs, the things that you contribute to the organization or could contribute. And we use a tool called the individual performance map to do that. We say, if you're the sales director and I'm coaching you, we say, well, who are your customers? Who are you delivering value to? All right, cool. What do you deliver? And those are your work outputs. So that's an example for a sales director. Or for example, here's an HR director, person from a small medical devices company. I was working with the president and his team, and they created this themselves. And so Matt, the HR director, delivers value to employees, line management, senior management, HR team, and the CEO. And you can see the list of countable nouns that are valuable that define this man's job. And we can coach to that. Or here, for those of you who are involved in the behavior analysis, behavioral health world, and we'll be coming back to this with Shane, here's a clinical supervisor in a applied behavior analysis organization who has an awful lot of work outputs, some of which are the same thing revised or improved. So for example, treatment plans, but treatment plans ready for review maybe are different because they've been edited. They've been in some ways have added value. Treatment plans ready for signature, etc. So those are just examples, but these are work outputs of a clinical supervisor. So if I were coaching her or him, this would be the domain of things we'd look for opportunities to either improve or develop or support, or maybe we'd want to add something to this person's capability so they could become, let's say, a director of clinical supervisors. So those are the outputs. Now, one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, this phrase, accomplishments liberate behavior. When we get to the discussion about behavior, we can be a little bit flexible about it, depending on the context. Again, some of my colleagues that work in the nuclear or the biotech industry, in which case you don't want to be too flexible with your procedures. But in many, many areas where we're coaching people, we can talk about different levels of detail depending on what the person needs. And we can also get really clear that whatever it takes, whatever the best way for you to achieve this accomplishment. Let's say you're a salesperson, for example, and we're working on new introductions to prospective customers. Well, some people might go to social events that have professionals at them to begin to meet people. Some people might ask their closest existing clients to introduce them to other people. Some people might go to LinkedIn. There's a lot of strategies and tactics for producing that output, new introductions. And a good coach might problem solve and sort of brainstorm around those with the person they were coaching. A really important thing that I mentioned is that we've seen now over quite a few years that, when you're trying to motivate somebody, you want to say, if you just ask more good questions, this will happen. Well, maybe, but that's kind of, you need some serious persuasion in that conversation. What I've learned is that almost every time you define crisply a work output, it's pretty easy to have a conversation about how that credibly contributes to something like quality or operational efficiency or revenue or profit or customer satisfaction or market share, sometimes a bunch of those things. And so one of the things we've learned is that by focusing on work outputs, it's a lot easier to engage our employees or the people who we're coaching because they can see more clearly what the line of sight is to the organization's benefit, why they're doing the thing. We've also like to emphasize, although this kind of looks hierarchical, I've been using this graphic for a long time. If we've got a coach and the person she or he is coaching, and they're having conversations around the 6 boxes about, what can we do to make a difference here? The intention is to be collaborative. It's not me against you. It's both of us looking at this performance and trying to see what the opportunities are to improve. Now, one of the things I already mentioned, and it's something that we recognized for years, and then as you'll see, we got enlightened about this by the Gallup organization. For years, looking at the 6 boxes model, we said, we can't necessarily change people's motives and preferences very much, but we can ask them so we understand what they are. However, the net effect of having expectations and feedback that are either working or not, of having tools and resources that are either available or working or not, etc. The net effect of having those first 5 categories or functions working or not working is a sort of residual attitude. So if those first 5 boxes are all working well, aligned, and positive, that person probably walks in the door in the morning on Monday all excited about their job. I was watching Elon Musk the other night, and he motivates people by saying, this is exciting because we can lead to humanity being a, multi-planetary species, and da 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 da. He likes to engage people in that kind of excited conversation if they're the right person to be working for him. On the other hand, if those things are all messed up in the first 5 boxes, you're going to have somebody who kind of looks like this young lady in the slide. So we've known that for years. But a few years ago, it's now been quite a few years, we encountered the Gallup organization's employee engagement poll. And they have a poll called often the Gallup 12, which when organizations have all their employees complete these polls, and it's essentially, you'll see if you haven't seen it before, it's a series of 12 statements, and the employee rates the extent to which they're true, not at all or a whole bunch. It turns out that organizations that have high ratings on those particular items have measurably better absenteeism, have less turnover, have less shrinkage or stealing, have more profitability, et cetera, et cetera. They're real bottom line results. And most of you who've worked in organizations know, I am sure, that the executives are paying attention to this. And so here's the Gallup 12. And this is these statements that you rate the extent to which they're true. I know what is expected of me at work. I have the materials and equipment I need to do my work right. At work, I have an opportunity to do what I do best every day, and so on. So I remember when I looked at those, and it's been a few years now, I had this oh my God moment where I realized these sorted beautifully into the 6 boxes model. And in fact, for me, it made really clear that this hunch, this observation I'd had for years, made perfect sense, which is that if we arrange the variables, the functions in this model, so they're positive, aligned, and complete, we're going to have pretty happy people, pretty engaged people. And so out of that, we can begin to look at some best practices for coaches, managers, and leaders. And you can look at this at your leisure, but the point is, we can talk about the ways in which coaches or managers or leaders can arrange, hopefully through collaborative conversations with their people, the optimal combination of behavior influences. So for example, this is from one client where we were applying this in a sales environment. So it's just one page from a tool, but down the left, you will see some work outputs for this particular sales process. Cell phone number of a person in the office was a really important accomplishment for this kind of salesperson, because it meant the receptionist trusted you, would open up the back office so you could talk to the doctor, various other things. This was an important output. People in the office who can verbalize your key messages, that's another important accomplishment. A good relationship with the prescriber, and you can see the criteria in the next column that sort of summarize what that is and so forth. So what we have down the left are a subset of the accomplishments or work outputs that a salesperson needs to achieve for this particular sales job. And you have some criteria so you know what a good one is. And then listed under tasks and tactics are a few of the best practices behaviors, but they're not the only ones. And so if you give a sales manager and his or her folks this tool, and they can problem solve, they can pick an output that was going to make a difference for them in their business this week or this month, and then they can problem solve it. You have an enormously practical and, for salespeople, very attractive tool. And you can go so far as to say that once we focus on accomplishments, we have a mechanism, thankfully, that can replace competencies to drive talent management, because we can recruit people with things like behavioral interviews built around the accomplishments that this job needs to produce. We can onboard people by identifying the outputs or accomplishments that they need to have up to speed sooner rather than later. We can give them job readiness training, and then we can move them into an ongoing cadence of coaching of the kind that I've been talking about now, a regular conversation between manager and the person that's working for that manager. There's about continuous improvement of capabilities. And then at some point, you can make decisions about promotion and transfer and compensation. But you can build this whole thing on accomplishments. The other thing that we've been starting to get quite interested in, and I have to thank Marty Wyckoff here for an introduction, and I'll explain that in a moment. But the phrase servant leadership has always struck me as a compelling phrase. And there's a lot of philosophy about it. There's a bunch of books out there about it. Some of them are kind of dense. But the notion is that if we can develop and support our people, if we can really understand our people's motives and preferences, if we can coach with the values of servant leadership, which is that we care about the person most of all, we think that accomplishment-based coaching can put this philosophy into action. And in fact, the thanks to Marty is that he introduced me to Howard Behar, who is a formerly president at Starbucks. He took Starbucks along with his colleague Howard Schultz from 28 stores to international. And Howard has been a proponent of servant leadership now for a long time, and he built a culture of that at Starbucks. And this book is the most readable, simple, straightforward description of the sort of values of servant leadership that I've ever seen. And so we're beginning to have some interesting discussions about how our accomplishment-based approach to coaching could be a great vehicle for this. A couple of last testimonials, and then we'll start talking with Shane. But here's the senior vice president of operations at a healthcare tech company who was introduced to our coaching thing. And he said, in over 20 years in the corporate world, this is the best training I've ever had. It helped define a clear link between business results, work outcomes, and individual behaviors. The framework and tools provide to help both plan and execute were outstanding. We're going full speed ahead, etc. So that was kind of nice to hear from a senior person. Here's another person, senior vice president of sales, who said some years ago, if I can't fit what I'm about to do as an executive or manager into the 6 boxes model, then I don't do it. This model and the understanding I've gained about the factors that drive successful performance are central to my management and leadership approach. And then here's one that I love. This is from a friend and colleague who is a founder and owner of a pretty rapidly growing behavioral health ABA company. And she said at one of our summer institutes a few years ago, she said, 6 boxes saved my company. And I didn't actually believe it. But I talked to her some more, and it's kind of true, because through a series of circumstances, she had to leave her company for a while and then come back to it. And she found that it was their staff retention had fallen off. A lot of things were not going so well. So they implemented our coaching approach and this whole framework as an ongoing problem-solving thing. And she said, performance thinking has had a measurable impact on my company. Our staff retention rate has increased immensely. New applicants report to us that we are the preferred place to work. Employee satisfaction, engagement have increased as well. It helped us move from being a struggling company to one with tools to overcome any performance obstacle. Now, obviously, these are pitches, but I don't mean to be presenting them entirely as a sales pitch. This is real people in real organizations saying how this accomplishment-based approach had an effect. We have our programs, and this is probably the shameless commerce part, the Performance Thinking Coach program, and then we have a set of leadership modules that follow up on that. And we're planning what we think is going to be our first Performance Thinking Leadership Institute next year. There's a white paper, and I will make that available to you right now. And you can just download it. You may have seen this before. It's available on our website also, but it's about leadership. It's about this general approach to leadership and management. And so I think that'll be accessible for you. But at this point, I want to ask Shane to come back and join me, and I'll turn off the slides in a moment. One of the reasons that I'm excited about this conversation is because, as I said earlier, Shane's kind of seen this from all angles in his own company and now in other companies. And so I've got a bunch of kind of questions that I'm going to prompt him to talk about. And let me turn off the slides and we can just get into it. So hi, Shane, you're back.
Yes, I'm back.
So what I thought would be helpful to start out with is, you've had quite a bit of experience with this. You've small companies and big, your own companies and others. And so I wondered if you could give us like a quick overview of kind of where you've been with this approach to management coaching, big companies, small companies, just so people understand where you're coming from.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I first introduced this approach or program in my own behavioral services company. And that was mostly to help new leaders sort of learn a straightforward approach to managing and improving performance, of their people. but also because it was a behavioral services company, clinical supervisors, I wanted to, give them an approach to continuously improve the quality of services that are delivered by the people they supervise. So then I ended up introducing this several years later when I merged with a larger allied health company. And that was more to enable, experienced leaders sort of sharpen their focus on improving valuable contributions, or what we call work outputs of the people that report to them. And then as a consultant, I've introduced the program to, small, mid-size, and fast-growing organizations, both for-profit, non-for-profit. And then next month, or in a couple of months, I'm excited that I'll be bringing the program into a large school district, which will be the first time.
Yeah, that's going to be pretty cool. So, okay, so that kind of helps give us a scope. I think actually, you've also taught this program a lot, and I've taught it also, but mostly in giant corporate entities. And so it's kind of interesting to me that you've brought this into a lot of different types of organizations. So, we're focusing on accomplishments. And I wanted to ask you kind of a two-part question. One is, for the managers or coaches that you've introduced this to, particularly after they get going, after they get a little bit fluent with it, what has been kind of their response and their engagement with it? And then the other half of the question is, the people they're coaching and managing, what are some of the things you've seen as this has been introduced, and like how they responded?
Yeah, I mean, the managers and supervisors that we introduced this to, they sort of latch onto it because it provides them a framework of how to develop and improve performance for their teams or departments. And then when it comes to people who they coach or supervise, I very much see that they like that the company's investing in them, right? They like that the company's investing in their development. And they appreciate that their manager or supervisor specifically focuses on things they need to produce, in their job. So what we would say on the job performance, sort of, rather than, inundate them with sort of nice to knows, like, here's everything I've learned over the past 20 years. And people don't necessarily need to know all that information to do the job well. So, yeah, those are some of the things.
That's a big deal. That's a good one. Well, the thing that I think also, because you've been working in a world where people learn about behavior, they know a lot about behavior. There are a lot of behavior analysts. And, when Tom Gilbert said, when he talked about the cult of behavior, some people that I speak with think we're talking about behaviorists, but that's not really what he was talking about. He was talking about the fact that leaders, managers, trainers, we all kind of think about behavior a lot, right? But so what I'm wondering is, to go into a little bit more, is in the environments you've been in, where people are all looking at the behavior of the people they're serving and all that, has this shift to accomplishments or work outputs, like how is that, say more about that. How has that affected their approach and thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of several examples. I mean, one off the bat that's pretty clear is that the training departments, that when they focus on what people need to produce in their job, and so they look at the outputs of their essentially trainees, then they start to get much more creative, and, to be honest, think of much more effective and cost effective ways to develop performance. So I've seen a lot of shifting from sort of didactic all-day workshops to more self-paced instruction plus coaching on the job. I mean, I think I've told you this one before. The long time ago, when I first started consulting for behavioral health organizations, I was working with a small company who, they were providing behavioral services across, several different counties, and they had a scheduler that did all the scheduling for everyone. but it was a bit of a nightmare because there's like a lot of process problems with the scheduling, and there were a lot of bottlenecks, and people were working around the scheduler. And so when we went in there and say, okay, let's just stop for a second and let's just focus on what is it that we're trying to achieve here? Client session appointments in calendars, right? That's what we need to have happen, and then people to go into those sessions. And so because we were able to just start with the work output, they weren't as bogged down by, well, this is always the way we've done it. We've always had somebody who takes care of this. You can't let the providers do their own scheduling. And that was sort of, when we introduced them to a practice management software that allowed their people to go online and put in their own appointments and manage them. And we were able to make a huge impact with this organization. But it all started with, what are we trying to produce? What is the process output here? And so it allows for more brainstorming, more creativity.
So as with a lot of the conversations we've had, there's a whole bunch of things you just said that I found really interesting. One of them is, you said a few minutes ago, that you can get leaner with this. Because if you, first of all, don't depend entirely on training, but not only that, you don't have all the nice to know stuff. You say, oh, you need to know what it takes to produce this valuable contribution of some kind. It instantly makes training leader. And that's one of the reasons that kind of the first steps that we take usually with training departments is we say, if you could make your training objectives, not people will be able to do or people will know, but rather people will be able to produce, whether it's decisions or data sets or relationships or budgets or widgets or whatever it is, that all of a sudden, whoosh, you've narrowed down everything that's needed because it's focused on that. So that was one very interesting thing that you said. The other thing that comes out of that is there's a lot of organizations, and I would say the world you're in, the behavioral health world, is especially, this is true, but it's also true in most of the other companies I work in. Training intensive businesses where you have to know a lot of stuff, or it seems like you have to know a lot of stuff. And so people spend an enormous amount of money on training, but they don't support it very well. And they often, I don't think, get the return on investment that they need. And so, for example, actually, we had somebody come from one of the larger behavioral health organizations come to me and say, could you help us turn our sort of define and improve our training and development organization? And I said, no, but I can help you become performance consultants. And my point being that I don't think it's all about training. It's about, yes, maybe there's some training and learning needed, but if we can put in the hands of managers and coaches the ability to incrementally, in response to individual needs, develop people, you've all of a sudden taken the burden off the shoulders of the training people trying to do everything. So that's also implicit in what you said. And then the other thing that you said, which I think is really cool about the output, about the schedule thing, the calendar item, which is, wait a minute, we don't have to think about that as part of the individual role. We can think about the accomplishment and what's the best way to get that. And if we define a process that produces it, maybe that person doesn't even have to do this anymore. And so the notion that when you don't focus on behavior, but you focus on accomplishments, you shift your whole world actually towards what's valuable here and what's the best way to get it, which kind of fades into the next question I was going to ask you. Because, in fact, it's funny, I posted something on Facebook last night, because what I realized is that my cat is highly innovative. And my cat is innovative because he happens to be a cat that's fearless. So he tries a lot of stuff. Unlike other cats that like get nervous, he tries all these things to get my attention because that's basically what he wants. And what I realize is, in the world of work, you need people who've created an environment where they're not afraid to try stuff, where it's okay to make some errors, maybe, depending on the context, and where behavior can, in fact, vary. So that example of yours was one interesting innovation opportunity, it seems to me. But I'm wondering if you can think of other examples where, by focusing on the accomplishments and the outputs, you've sort of freed people up to try different stuff. Is that part of your experience?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So just like you've been using the nuclear example, since behavioral health services is part of the medical model, there's, similar to aviation, there's protocols that you must follow in order to keep people safe, in this case, to produce, client progress. And but it's more, I've seen it in more work with the back office staff. And and because I can say this now, my wife, because we recently got married, she also owns a behavioral health agency. And fairly recently she got a new, executive assistant. And one of the things that sort of never, we were always used to, okay, here's what I need you to accomplish. Here's all the strategies and tactics to do this. But this person was very skilled and they came from the corporate world. And basically, so Jen, my wife, asked her executive assistant, would you produce an outdoor staff, summer party? And then they kind of decided a bit on the criteria of like, it's got to be kid friendly. It's okay if people have, some adult beverages. But that was it.
Yeah.
Came back like a month later. I mean, you should have seen it. There's taco truck, like all these games for kids.
Yeah.
And so they're just, you didn't have to get into a lot of detail in the behavior in order to produce that, because they were a high performer. You could just say, here's the work output I need you to produce. Here's the criteria. You get that shared agreement. Then the person went and did a fabulous job. Of course, then they get rewarded by everyone who attends and by her boss, Jen. So I see examples of like that. That's
a cool example.
Yeah, and it also leads to less sort of micromanaging and more autonomy. So,
well, the other thing I would bet, we talk about the relationship between coach and the person you're coaching as being collaborative and sort of potentially innovative. But I also would say that I'll bet you that person asked around about what would people like to have for their food or whatever. So what I'm struck by, I was thinking about sales, because sales is an area that I spent a lot of time, supporting. And in sales, if you have very clearly defined milestones or outputs that you need to accomplish, then a manager and the person they're coaching or a bunch of peers, they can get together and brainstorm. And they say, well, you could, you could invite them to a Super Bowl game, but you also could connect with them on LinkedIn and whatever it is, they come up with different ideas, and you literally liberate people to come up with these different ideas. And as long as you stay within the technical guidelines, right, and quality guidelines and ethical guidelines, there's a lot more freedom for generating superior solutions, I think. So it applies in a lot of places.
Absolutely.
That's a good one. I like.
Yeah.
How about hiring and onboarding? Because I know this is outside the coaching thing, but it's still about accomplishments. So I know you've spent a fair amount of time developing essentially job descriptions built around outputs or accomplishments. So are those part of what you do when you're hiring and onboarding? Are you use when you're hiring and onboarding people?
Yeah. So, I mean, you showed the diagram where where we talked about continuous accomplishment, based talent development. And in there, we have onboarding and recruiting or recruiting, and then onboarding, and then job readiness. I mean, so when organizations, or some organizations that I've worked with have, moved through the process of driving performance thinking through their enterprise. And yes, you do see, so in onboarding or in hiring, you see people being selected based on what they have produced in the past, or actually what they can produce now at the time of hiring, rather than activities that they've done or activities that they participated in. So, for example, a young clinician may learn how to write a treatment plan in graduate school. And then, but it may be with a group or a team. And so maybe they've only done a few sections, or they had someone senior there working with them. And then, so you can ask them, have you actually produced a treatment plan? And here are our criteria. Here's what our template do you think, of course, learning some of our language and stuff, you would be able to fill that out? And you can give some examples of where, okay, what would you put here? What, and it changes it changes the conversation, because they know right away that the thing that is valuable is the things that they produce on the job. Another in onboarding, when you provide people descriptions and measures of work outputs that for their role, I mean, they are much more clear and concise about what they need to produce, and especially when you've defined the criteria, like this is what a good one looks for us. I've definitely seen that help people, get excited about the job, but also it helps, whether it's the trainers or HR professionals or maybe, the hiring managers, it helps them think about, okay, what are some of these things that you've never produced before? And then let's prioritize just working on these things first in your job, and not, overwhelming them with this you have to be able to do all this on day one.
Training.
Right. Yeah. So those are some of the ways that I've seen it.
That's a good one. We've not everybody has taken this suggestion, but the notion, the phrase onboarding is one of those kind of fuzzy phrases that some people, I jokingly say, it just means by the end of onboarding, you've filled out some papers and you know where the bathroom is, and then other places you're ready for your job or whatever. But to me, onboarding, if it goes beyond sort of the bathroom and knowing how to get your computer, it's a series of steps, and people tend to do. I think there is an awful lot of sheep dippy training that often goes on there. That's like, okay, we're going to train them with all this stuff. But if you know what outputs are most important to be able to produce in the first weeks and months on the job, you can stage that so that what you were just describing is that you can focus on the stuff that you need to get up to speed on now. And of course, when you do, it's naturally reinforcing for people, because they say, "Oh, I can produce one of these now. Let's go on to the next thing." And it's really, I think it's a benefit for everybody. And coaching becomes the mechanism for doing a lot of that. So it's another example where training can sort of not have to bear the whole burden if there are people who are doing accomplishment-based coaching. So something you said, you've sort of alluded to, but I want to ask a little bit more about it, which is, and we're coming up against the hour. We're going to go a little bit longer. If you have to drop off, we won't be offended, but you will get a recording, because we're going to go a little bit longer. There's too many interesting things to talk about here. But I think you used a phrase something like, when people start getting into this or whatever. What I've observed is that, and we always pitch this, but you've experienced it in a lot of different contexts, is that there's an implication for developing a sort of a different cultural perspective in a couple of different ways. One is that when people get good at this, it's not something we just do once a month or once a quarter. It's an ongoing conversation. So we try to encourage organizations to set an expectation of a cadence, like weekly check-ins, let's say. And in the beginning, maybe those weekly check-ins are fairly formal, and you're doing the individual performance map and you're identifying stuff for development and all that. But at some point, it can be almost like at the proverbial water cooler before COVID, where it's like, hey, that thing you're working on, I had an idea. You might want to try going over and talking to Jack, because he's really good at that, and see how he does it. I mean, just that becomes part of that ongoing conversation. Or like from the example I mentioned from the ABA owner, where it starts to become a cultural thing. And you've got your leadership team, and they're problem solving things around the things we can do in the 6 boxes to help develop, some output or other. So I guess my question is, you've been around with this work for long enough now that you've seen it gain maturity in some organizations. What does that look like as everybody starts to share the same language and framework?
Yeah, so there's something that we talk about in the program, or a question we ask participants, and it leads to a discussion. We say, who is responsible for performance, right? And then we come to an agreement that the organization, the manager or supervisor, and the individual themselves, it's collaborative. They're all responsible for performance, right? The organization's, well, provide, before the global pandemic, provide a building and,
Right.
place to go to work and all, computers and tables and chairs
Hmm.
and everything like that. Obviously, the manager has to set clear expectations, right? Provide feedbacks, and so when a more mature sort of performance organization, you can really see that. So you have a shared language. So the individual can say, things like, I need more, I need you to clarify expectations on this, or this tool that I'm using is really obstructing me from meeting the criteria that you've asked for, right? So
Hmm.
um, so I think that the shared language of the 6 boxes and performance thinking is one.
Hmm.
You also have a much more objective view of performance. So one of
Yeah.
the things that when I first come in, oh, sh- he or she is not very good at their job and they're a real problem, and it's a lot of blaming the individual performer, where you that sort of like leaves the conversation, the vocabulary, and we start to think, okay, let's they're not performing according to expectations, so let's
Hmm.
pause and let's analyze performance and think like, okay, well, what's in place that's obstructing this performance, or what's
Hmm.
missing that could help? So those
Yeah.
questions are automatic.
Yeah.
And then maybe the bigger and most sort of um, like biggest difference, or the way that it impacts the organization the most, is around when they're rolling out new policies or procedures, or maybe a new system or software, right? The leaders and managers are thinking, okay, now we're asking someone to do something different in their job. So we need to reset expectations. Are they clear?
Hmm.
Are we giving them good criteria, well-defined
Hmm.
criteria? How are the tools different? Do they need job
Hmm.
aids or reference? Now we're asking them to go in the field. Do they have, internet that works off of Wi-Fi, or systems that work off of Wi-Fi? All kinds of things where they're starting to plan and think through how to support, and that just becomes part
Hmm.
of the day-to-day activities. So it's
Yeah.
not here's the policy, roll it out, you have to do this, start Monday, let's go. Why
Right.
aren't you
Right.
doing it? Blame the performer. None of
Right.
that.
It's interesting because we used to you earlier used a phrase, and we used to use that as one of our marketing messages. This changes the conversation, and what you described is that. And it's interesting when I think of a coaching exercise, and where you have kind of like a face-to-face conversation, and that sort of blame me, it's your fault. No, it's my fault. If the people, figuratively at least, turn toward the performance chain in the 6 boxes model, it's like they're both looking at it and saying, how can we improve this? And the person is important, but if anything, this makes the person feel better because it's a collaborative effort to help them, as opposed to this bumping of heads thing. And what I've noticed is that can take the heat out of a fair number of conversations that would otherwise be kind of a little bit challenging. So that makes a lot of sense to me, that what you
Yeah, I
described.
mean, when a manager has or supervisor has a conversation with their team or direct report, and they say, "Listen, I'm responsible for planning and arranging, positive behavior influence, those factors in the workplace that are going to support or improve your performance," and they say that out
Mm-hmm.
loud, they own that. Then it's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, so I'm gonna, the company, for this reason, we're gonna ask you to produce this, and they're tying it to business results so that they can see the direct connection. And
Mm-hmm.
then they say, okay, how can I help do that?
Yeah.
What do you need from me? What do you need from the organization? And so now it is less of a talking down. It's
Mm-hmm.
more of a let's, work together
Mm-hmm.
for the
Mm-hmm.
greater benefit of the organization.
Yeah.
And so you see that in relationships, you see that in conversations.
Mm-hmm.
um, Frankly, when managers come in the room, people don't just jet the other way because they're afraid they're just going to get,
Right. Yeah.
some,
Smacked.
right.
Well, what's interesting about that, I was thinking as you were speaking, I really do think shifting from behavior to accomplishments helps that a lot too, because it isn't like you're supposed to behave like this. It's no, we want to figure out a way that you can produce one of these, and maybe that's the way to behave, or maybe it's not. But it's really a different, as they say these days, mindset. So two other things. I don't want to take too much more time with people, but one of them is then you've both been a consultant to and been a leader in a company. When you look at leaders and managers, people who are supposed to be serving this role of coach and manager, how then do you think about evaluating and developing them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, well, one is here's what some ways that I believe that they are different, or I would evaluate. One is just simply, do they have the ability to plan and arrange positive behavior influences to support their teams and direct reports? So are they thinking through, the cells in the six boxes, and understanding when things are missing? And that's probably why there's a discrepancy in performance. So that's one. Two, the really good managers and leaders view talent development and continuous performance improvement as an effective strategy. They prioritize it, and they value internal growth and development. And so you see that as almost they're using it as a competitive advantage, because they're thinking, well, if we, especially leaders, if managers can help teams and individuals improve just a bit of performance, and you're across multiple locations, multiple states, right? I haven't had an opportunity to work with an international company yet, but I'm sure that will come. But right, and so think about, the business results we're going to offer, where the quality will increase, x-fold. We'll generate, that much more revenue. We will remain in compliance, for a higher percentage of time. And so the thought that, like, this is something that needs to be prioritized. It's not just, reviews are up, 90 days, and just,
Right. Yeah, we better.
They're like, when we can get our teams and our departments performing even just a little bit more effectively, they understand the impact that can make on the overall organization.
So there's two things I would put, among others, but two things that you said that remind me of things. One is the way you were talking about the relationships that can develop there is why I started getting interested in the connection with servant leadership, because this actually is about helping people. I mean, it actually is about helping people be both productive and happy and meeting their needs and all the rest of it. And so to me, this is not an artificial connection at all. I think this whole approach has enormous potential for that. And then the other thing was kind of implicit in what you were saying is, I've been doing these little YouTube bits lately on leadership and management that we haven't published yet. But one of them is, as most people know, when an individual contributor is first promoted to manager, whether it's in high tech or sales or behavior analysis or whatever, a lot of times they just kind of think naively they're supposed to be the smartest person on the team. They're supposed to be the one that really does it well. And actually, the message here is, no, your job is shifted. You're supposed to enable other people to perform super well. And so just that perspective, the extent that we do what you're describing, to me is enormous, because like you say, it's a business strategy. It's not just like being nice to people, which is a very good thing to do. So I thought those were two kind of really important sort of points. And there was one other thing.
Can I just say one thing about that? Because, I think it just goes full circle back to your point about coaching. Because if you think of your job as a leader or manager as a coach, right? The coach, even sometimes, especially of late, in the NBA, they've hired, former NBA stars or players
Right.
to now be coaches, right? They don't go out on
Yeah.
the court. They're not shooting 3-pointers. They're not
Right.
trying to, right? So they
Right.
realize their job is to make their team, their players, the best that they possibly can, to work cohesively, right? To
Yep.
run a purchase. And so that's the thing when you talked about the shift. You're when they're promoted to management or leadership, it's not now I get to walk around and I have the parking spot. It's okay, now I have this team. My challenge is to help them perform better at their job. And that's and so I need to think about all the strategies to do that, and constantly be, just like a professional coach would be, awake at night to think about how that they can do that better.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'm a fan of Pete Carroll, the coach of the Seahawks, and I think that's where he comes from. But, that's an important point because not everybody's suited to that. Sometimes, in fact, they do want to be the smartest engineer in the team. Well, then find a way for them to do that and be individuals. A very good friend of mine often tells me, former senior vice president of sales, he's not the best salesperson in the world, but he's pretty darn good at getting teams to work together. And having worked with him now, I know that. And it's, some of those NBA guys are probably not going to be able to coach from the sidelines. They're going to say, hey, get out of the way, let me do it, at some point. And so that helps select too. So one other thing, and that is some of the people who participate in this center will see this come from the field of behavior analysis. And in the field of behavior analysis, there's a thing called OBM, Organizational Behavior Management. And you are an extremely well-trained, experienced guy there. You worked with one of the best as a graduate student with Cloyd Heighton, one of the best there is. Behavioral systems, et cetera. And so to the extent that you're in that world where people know about OBM, they even come to us sometimes and say, well, we want to do some OBM. And I always say what we do is a little bit different because we've shifted. Yes, all the things you know about behavior are relevant, of course, because we got to talk about how to arrange and support behavior. But we're focused on accomplishments, which many, many OBM people don't really think clearly about that. So you can sit on both sides of that, being an extremely well-trained OBMer. What do you think the differences are, or are there differences between whatever you want to, performance thinking, if we use our kind of brand name, and OBM? How would you talk about that?
Well, you're definitely putting me in a difficult place because, like you said, when you learn from someone like Dr. Cloyd Heighton, there I would say there's very not as much difference because you're learning to focus on business results, to create value as a performance consultant, to do good analysis that goes far beyond just the individual, right, at the systems level. So
Sure.
One of the things though that I have seen in coming into different organizations that have had some more maybe traditional OBM projects or whatnot, is that they tend to focus maybe on a particular performance problem or discrepancy, and then work through to try to solve that. Where something that we talk about how performance thinking is a plain English approach, right, to understanding and improving human performance. But the biggest part of this is that it can be shared across the organization. So the people that are receiving the coaching are maybe not learning all necessarily.
We're losing you somewhat in the audio.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Unfortunately, I'm not sure why. Yeah, I can. Yeah, keep going. I'm sorry. I just
No, that's okay.
Up a little bit.
So I think what we really something that is really important from our approach is that we are trying to make anyone that coaches people in their job, that by empowering them and giving them a framework, that now you have like change agents all across the organization. When people share a language and a framework, then they could say, I think this is a box one problem, and boom, let's reset expectations by define, like you can go to some shorthand. I think that also understand that it's always an inner working system. And so that it's not just sort of a checklist and then it's kind of done. There's always analysis continuously, always brainstorming and always choosing behavior influences or that will support or establish or develop new performance. And so those are some of the things that I think of right away. The systems approach, the common language, and the fact that really anyone can learn this approach. And there's some my OBM colleagues do some pretty complex and challenging things, and which is awesome, and solve problems and make impact. But it's not necessarily, I don't always see the focus on sort of building a language of performance thinking and a focus on continuous performance development throughout the whole organization.
Yeah, fair enough. That makes perfect sense. Now, I'm not in any way dissing OBM. I don't mean to say anything negative about it. What I've noticed, what I think Tom Gilbert added, because, he was a behaviorist by beginning. What I think he added was the explicit, we call it tools and resources, but the explicit definition of what he called instruments, all of the enablers in the environment, is not something that always comes up in the organizational behavior management kind of analysis. And also, I've observed that although training is a big part of OBM often, it's often almost like an add-on as far as and when we view it as skills and knowledge, it's a little bit different, because you can get skills and knowledge with a good job aid or a good other thing. And so what I think Gilbert brought to the table was, by expanding from the 3-term contingency to the individual and the environment, I think it's a little bit more robust framework. But everything about behavior science can be applied in the context of it. So like I say, I'm not trying to diss anybody. I'm just trying to sort of understand from somebody like you I was never trained formally in OBM, even though I was a student with B.F. Skinner. So I sort of know about behavior science, but you know a lot more about the details. Anyway, we've taken people's time here, 20 minutes over. Is there any last comments that I haven't asked you about or you'd like to add, Shane? Because we could go on for a long time, but any points you want to be sure to make?
The only other thing I can think about is just that when we talk about accomplishment-based coaching approach, that really where it sort of boils down to an approach that sets the context to make performance development a two-way conversation for both the performer and manager. And it's a way of sharing, insights, and ultimately coming to agreed upon steps that need to be implemented to change performance, right? And so, that it's complex, but it's not more complicated than that, right?
Fair enough. Yep, good point. Okay, there's a couple more slides I'm gonna put up here, and then I know we've gone a long time, but there's still some people hanging with us. So let me see if there's any Q&A, but I think I had one more slide here of some kind that I was going to put in here. Let's see what it was. Oh yeah, well, we've got an open practice. This is the shameless commerce part. We have an open practitioner program coming up September 30th, and you can learn about it on our website. Both Shane and I will be co-facilitating this, so we welcome people from the behavioral health ABA world as well as the corporate world. They often learn from one another. And I'm hoping that we're going to also offer an open version of the coaching program facilitated by Shane sometime in the next few months. We're not sure yet. Stay tuned. And then here's just a bunch of sources of a bunch more kind of free information. Let me go to the chat box and see if anybody still has any attention for this. Any questions or comments from you all? I know we've gone a long time, but I hope it was valuable. Anybody have any questions or observations or anything else that you'd like to add here? Oh, here we go, Scott. Scott Mills. What are the biggest challenges you see around defining criteria and measures? Any tips to overcome those? Actually, let me start with Roger because he was first. How does feedback work in your coaching model? Basically, feedback works as, it's box one, Roger. And so feedback is very important. And one of the things we encourage, and this is an implementation thing, because as you, I'm sure, know from your own experience, a company can implement by training people in a coaching method, but then they don't actually support it. So we try to work with our clients to create an implementation plan that, among other things, sets a cadence for check-ins. And those check-ins ought to be like every week or so. And, it depends on the organization. But feedback is going to be an inherent part of this. Like, how you doing on that? Let me give you some feedback. Sometimes feedback is an explicit thing. Like if somebody's learning a new thing, you say, well, let's spend a little time every Friday and I'll give you some extra feedback on there, or send it to me or whatever. So feedback is always part of the picture. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's part of it. Scott Mills, what are the biggest challenges defining criteria and measures? Well, as we said, and I think we might have even done a webinar on this, I can't recall, but we think of measures as being either of business results, which are lagging indicators, work outputs, which you can count if you can define good ones, and behavior. And we don't think people should measure everything. But in a coaching environment, if I'm working with an individual, usually the easiest way to do it is to monitor those work outputs. If there's things that, if they happen frequently enough to be able to sit down with a person and say, how's this going? Or how many good proposals have you produced? Or what is, whatever the outputs are, we can very informally measure or monitor, and we can turn it into spreadsheets and graphs if we want to. But outputs, I think, are very often the first thing to look at for what we can measure to see how things are going. And then the criterion part is tricky, because what we teach people is we want to define the characteristics of an output that are easily agreed upon, that are not open to interpretation, so that we can say, yep, that was a good one, and everybody will agree. Now that's challenging, but what we found is that usually a person who's coaching and being coached, that's one of the things we get them to collaborate on and get clear on. Kirsty has a question. Oops, where'd it go? It just disappeared. Oh, so you responded. Good deal. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? So I think we answered your questions. Any other comments from anybody? Well, thank you, everybody. We really appreciate your coming. You'll get the link to this recording if you want to share it with anybody. And thank you, Shane. I always learn stuff when we have these conversations, because there's always these implicit things. And of course, I'm like the philosopher of performance thinking, but you've done so much hands-on stuff that it's always really helpful to hear what you have to say. So thank you, everybody. I think we're done for the day.
My pleasure.